In the remote highlands of the southern Appalachians, the winter of 1752 marked the rise of a new chief whose name would never be spoken without caution. The succession was not peaceful. It followed a decade of clan skirmishes, hunting ground disputes, and the betrayal of kin. Those who survived the civil bloodletting carried scars that told a simple truth: mercy was absent from this leader's vision of power. Coronations among the isolated mountain tribes of the period were rare and carried no single fixed tradition. Each leader marked the occasion according to his will, some through dance, others through feasting, others still by waging war. But this chief sought a different symbol, one that would not fade with song or drink. His ritual would be designed to instill a lasting terror, ensuring obedience without question. The captives taken in the final battles of the Succession War would become its centerpiece. The chosen site was an icy gorge, flanked by jagged cliffs and thick forest. Oral tradition described the place as haunted by the spirits of those who had perished in snowstorms. But the chief had another purpose for it. The gorge was home to a pack of wolves that had never been tamed, hunted, or driven away. For generations, the animals had prowled the area, feeding on deer, elk, and, when opportunity allowed, the dead left after skirmishes. In the tribal worldview, they were more than animals. They were regarded as enforcers of natural law, stripping flesh from the weak, leaving only the strong to endure. In the weeks before the coronation, the chief ordered the construction of a ceremonial enclosure at the gorge's base. Prisoners, warriors from rival clans, women accused of treachery, and young men taken in raids were bound and forced to march from distant settlements. The procession through snow-choked passes served its own purpose: to display the chief's victory and remind all who saw it that rebellion's end was humiliation before death. When the day came, the air was brittle with cold. Drums beat in a slow, steady rhythm, carrying over the mountains like a heartbeat from the earth itself. The prisoners were arranged in a wide circle on the frozen ground, shackled together at the wrists and neck. Fires burned along the cliff walls, not for warmth, but to illuminate the enclosure for those who watched from above. The chief sat elevated on a carved wooden chair, a crown of woven sinew and fox fur upon his head. He neither smiled nor addressed the crowd. This was not a celebration. It was a demonstration. At his signal, warriors withdrew the barriers at the far end of the enclosure. From the darkness beyond, the first wolf emerged, lean, black-furred, its breath misting in the air. Then another and another, until a dozen circled the captives. The crowd did not cheer. In this culture, death, even that of an enemy, was not entertainment, but a reaffirmation of order. The first attack came without warning. One prisoner stumbled. The wolves seized the opportunity, pulling him down. His screams were absorbed into the drumbeat, his body dragged into the shadows. There was no intervention. The chief remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the chaos below. This was the language of his rule: power unquestioned, enforced not by negotiation, but by the raw certainty of annihilation. As the hours passed, the circle tightened. Some captives begged for a swift death. Others stood rigid in defiance, knowing it would change nothing. By nightfall, the snow was churned to mud and stained dark. The wolves fed until their muzzles glistened, retreating only to return again. The ritual did not end quickly. Over 3 nights, the surviving captives were left chained in the enclosure, exposed to hunger, cold, and the constant presence of the predators. Each dawn brought fewer survivors. Those who remained on the 3rd day were dragged before the chief. There was no mercy, no ransom. With a single gesture, they were forced back into the enclosure for the final time. When it was done, the remains were left where they had fallen. Carrion birds claimed what the wolves had not. The gorge itself became a place no one willingly approached. For years afterward, stories of the blood-crowned coronation traveled beyond the chief's own people, carried by traders, deserters, and those who had seen the aftermath with their own eyes. To his followers, the chief's act was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a statement that leadership required more than the inheritance of a title. It demanded the creation of a fear so deep it could not be undone by seasons or distance. To his enemies, it was proof that he would stop at nothing to secure his rule. The wolves remained in the gorge for decades. Long after the chief's death, parents warned their children that to stray too far into the mountains was to risk meeting the same fate as those who had defied the man beneath the blood crown. In 648 BC, during the final throes of his civil war against his brother king Shamash-shum-ukin, Ashurbanipal laid siege to Babylon. The city faltered under siege, famine coursed through its streets, and the very fabric of society unraveled with each passing day. The besieged Babylonians, pushed beyond the limits of survival, endured the unthinkable. Some accounts preserve that, in their desperation, they resorted to consuming their own children, a haunting testament to despair and the depths to which human endurance can fall. As the city finally capitulated, Ashurbanipal's own inscriptions, a chilling record in stone, do not shy from brutal clarity. He claimed, "Their carved-up bodies I fed to dogs, to pigs, to wolves, to eagles, to birds of the heavens, to fishes of the deep." This was not metaphor or poetic flourish. Such detail, carved into palace walls, served to expose the agony of his enemies and to weaponize horror as a political instrument. Art and text became tools of psychological warfare, sculpted reminders that resistance invited annihilation. The cultural context deepens the emotional weight of this atrocity. For Babylonians, bodies were sacred, and burial rites were inseparable from the maintenance of both familial honor and cosmic order. To see those remains desecrated, fed to beasts, cast to scavengers, was to witness the collapse of civilization itself, a spiritual violation layered atop physical destruction. This was cruelty inflicted not merely to kill, but to erase the dignity and memory of the fallen. Ashurbanipal's decision to record such acts so graphically reveals the calculated logic of terror in Neo-Assyrian statecraft. His inscriptions and reliefs depicted acts of flaying, impalement, dismemberment, and public torture, often inflicted upon elite captives or enemy combatants. In this singular case of Babylon, the scale and detail of the imagery went far beyond customary brutality. It was not only violence, it was performance. By casting famine victims into post-mortem prey for animals, the king made a final declaration: even in death, his enemies would serve the empire. The emotional toll on survivors is difficult to comprehend. Those who lived through the siege carried the echoes of cannibalism, not merely as a tragedy, but as a moral abyss. The knowledge that children had been consumed in the grip of starvation could never be separated from the horror of watching the corpses of loved ones mutilated and fed to animals. For these people, defeat was not just military, it was the annihilation of their humanity. Across the Near East, the story of Babylon's fall and its macabre aftermath spread quickly. Rumors of cannibalism and desecration took on a life of their own, and neighboring cities began to surrender before enduring a similar fate. Looking back, the Siege of Babylon stands as a moment where war and famine fused into a deliberate ritual of terror. By immortalizing the feeding of human flesh to animals, Ashurbanipal turned a military victory into a permanent warning. The message was carved into stone as much as it was into the collective memory of the region. Resist, and your body will not rest, it will be consumed. In the cold silence that followed, Babylon's streets lay empty, its people vanished, consumed by hunger or by fate. Ashurbanipal's legacy was not only of kingship, but of cosmic horror, a ruler who turned starvation into spectacle, feeding victims to beasts as both punishment and proclamation. The lesson endured for generations. Resistance could lead not just to death, but to something far darker, oblivion made grotesque. In the ancient world, the wolf was both a symbol and a sentence. Across the northern frontiers of the Roman Empire, from the forests of Gaul to the frozen edges of Dacia, the howl of a wolf carried more than the promise of death. It carried the memory of those condemned to face it. While lions and leopards dominated the Roman arenas, records preserved in the writings of Seneca and in fragments of provincial chronicles suggest that in the colder provinces, wolves, caught in the wild and starved for days, were sometimes unleashed upon prisoners. Unlike the lions of the Colosseum, the wolf was not exotic. It was familiar. It was the predator that had stalked the villagers' flocks for generations, its teeth known, its hunger understood. To be killed by one was not a distant imperial spectacle, but a local terror made flesh. The practice bore a dual purpose: punishment and intimidation. Roman governors in remote provinces understood the value of using local fears to maintain control. In Gaul, prisoners of war, often tribal leaders who resisted Roman taxation, were sometimes bound to stakes at the edge of a forest clearing. At dusk, wolves, drawn by the scent of blood from fresh livestock carcasses, were driven toward the captives. The soldiers would not intervene, they would watch, the condemned would scream, and by dawn, the wolves would vanish back into the tree line, leaving only bone. Centuries later, this tactic would not vanish with the empire. In the fractured kingdoms of medieval Europe, wolves retained their role as both pest and instrument of fear. In the law codes of 12th century Hungary, the punishment for certain crimes, theft from the king's herds, or treachery against the crown, included expositio lupus, exposure to wolves. Prisoners were stripped, chained to a post beyond the walls, and left through the night. There was no audience, no applause. Only the knowledge that the condemned would hear the howls long before they felt the teeth. Wolves, unlike trained war dogs, could not be commanded, but they could be lured. Chroniclers of the Teutonic Order in the Baltic Crusades describe grisly episodes in which captured pagan leaders were executed by being left in snowy woods with fresh cuts to attract predators. These were not spontaneous attacks of nature. They were orchestrated killings, calculated to draw out terror. The power of such executions lay not only in the deaths themselves, but in the message they carried. To the living, they were a reminder that the ruler's power extended beyond soldiers and swords. It reached into the wild, bending nature itself into an accomplice. It told the people that the forest, the very land around them, could be turned against them if they defied their lord. Religious sanction sometimes cloaked these acts. In certain frontier monasteries, chroniclers framed the deaths as divine judgment, wolves as instruments of God's wrath upon heretics and oath-breakers. The moral was clear. Resist the authority, and you would not even receive the dignity of burial. Your soul, like your body, would be torn and scattered. In time, such punishments became rarer, not out of mercy, but because wolves themselves began to vanish from many parts of Europe. Yet their memory remained. In folktales, rebels and outlaws were given to the wolves, a phrase whose roots lay in actual decrees and punishments. By the late Middle Ages, the image of the wolf executioner had passed into legend, often stripped of its political context, told instead as a cautionary story to keep children from wandering into the woods. But behind the legend was the truth. Men in power had long recognized that fear is most potent when it feels inevitable. A man can fight a soldier, he cannot reason with hunger. And in the darkness of a medieval night, chained to a post as the howls drew nearer, a condemned man's final knowledge was that his death would not be quick, and it would not be clean. It was not spectacle that made the wolf execution enduring in the memory of Europe's frontiers. It was its intimacy. There was no distance between killer and victim, no arena to separate the crowd from the blood. Only the cold air, the smell of iron and fur, and the sound of paws moving in the snow. And when the night was over, nothing remained but tracks that faded with the morning frost. The empire's stones have fallen, the medieval strongholds have rotted away, and the wolves themselves are gone from many lands. But in the stories of the frontier, the howls have never stopped, carrying across centuries the memory of punishments where man and beast became partners in cruelty. The Assyrian Empire did not merely conquer, it made examples. In the reign of Ashurnasirpal II, the treatment of prisoners was as much a weapon as the sword itself. When a city fell, the taking of captives was not an administrative necessity. It was an act of statecraft, designed to break the spirit of every people who might imagine resistance. The captives' march was the opening act in this calculated terror. Those taken alive were stripped of status and identity the moment they were bound. Warriors were shackled in neck irons heavy enough to pull them forward with each painful step. Their wrists were lashed behind their backs, the cords cutting into flesh already torn from battle. Women were forced to walk alongside them, carrying whatever spoils the soldiers demanded, grain sacks, looted vessels, or the children of other captives, too small to keep pace on their own. The journey began at the city's gate. Here, before the ruins still smoldering from siege fires, the captives were assembled in columns. Assyrian scribes recorded the tally: men for labor, women for servitude, children for re-education in the empire's ways. Above them stood the victors, officers in conical helmets and fringed garments, overseeing the procession. The march was as much for the watching soldiers as for the broken prisoners. It reminded the army of its own power and of the king's unchallengeable will. The route chosen was never direct. The Assyrians made a point to pass through allied and recently subdued territories, displaying their human spoils like trophies. This was deliberate psychological warfare. For the watching villagers, the sight of their former allies, leaders, or kin walking in humiliation was a warning more effective than any treaty. They saw the marks of defeat, not in ruined walls, but in living, breathing people reduced to objects. For the captives, the journey was an unending ritual of exhaustion and submission. There was no rest except in places the soldiers allowed, and no food but what was rationed to keep them moving. The sick were left to collapse on the roadside, their fate sealed by the scavengers that followed. Those who tried to flee were made examples of, sometimes executed on the spot, sometimes mutilated and forced to rejoin the column, their injuries a walking deterrent to others. In the empire's heartlands, the captives would be divided according to the needs of the state. Strong men were sent to quarry stone, build fortifications, or dig irrigation canals. Women were dispersed among households or placed into temple service. Children, if not killed, were absorbed into the Assyrian cultural system, taught its language, religion, and loyalty to its king. The march was thus not just a prelude to punishment, it was the first stage in erasing entire peoples. The reliefs carved on the palace walls at Nimrud and Nineveh do not hide this cruelty. They show captives in lines, roped together at the neck, their faces rendered in agonizing detail. Some carry baskets, others lead livestock, reminders that they were as much a resource as the gold and grain seized in conquest. Inscriptions boast of the thousands taken, the lands emptied of inhabitants. The very act of recording these events in stone made them permanent propaganda. It is easy, centuries later, to see such marches as distant and alien, the barbarity of an ancient world long gone. But for those who endured them, they were the defining moment of their lives, the instant when home, family, and name were stripped away. The captives' march was not only a punishment for defiance, it was a warning carved into the memory of every survivor and every witness. And so the Assyrian Empire expanded, not just through the sword, but through the slow, deliberate breaking of human will. Cities surrendered before sieges began, not because they could not fight, but because they had seen the columns of the defeated. In the shadow of those endless marches, resistance seemed less like courage and more like suicide. The captives' march ended not at the edge of a battlefield, but in the annihilation of a people's future. And in this, the Assyrians proved a truth as old as empire itself, that the destruction of the body begins with the destruction of hope. In the early 13th century, the Mongol Empire was expanding at a pace unmatched in history. Its leaders, from Temujin, who the world would remember as Genghis Khan, to his sons and grandsons, understood that conquest alone could not hold an empire. It was not merely the destruction of armies that brought cities to their knees, but the destruction of will. For this, the Mongols perfected a language of fear, spoken not in words but in demonstrations. Among their most chilling acts was the deliberate staging of mass executions in full view of both their own warriors and the conquered. The Mongols had studied the psychology of subjugation as keenly as they had studied horsemanship and war. They knew that a public death was not just an ending, but a message, one written in flesh, one impossible to misinterpret. The method varied by region and circumstance, but one of the most terrifying was the circle of death, employed when the Mongols captured rebellious settlements or sought to make an example of prominent prisoners. Captives, men, women, and sometimes children, were bound and placed in a wide circle facing inward. Around them, Mongol warriors formed a second ring, their horses restless, their weapons drawn. No one could flee. At the center of this human ring, executioners moved with methodical precision. Sometimes it was archers who ended the lives of those within. Other times, the killing was slower, more personal. In certain accounts from Persian chroniclers, captives were deliberately left standing as others were cut down beside them, each moment designed to erode whatever remained of their resolve. The point was never to grant the condemned a private death. The point was to ensure that every survivor, both inside and outside the circle, would carry the memory of it. The Mongols understood that terror could be more enduring than any fortification. They allowed messengers to flee deliberately, knowing that the tale of what they had seen would arrive long before the Mongol armies themselves. Such spectacles were often held in winter, when the hard ground and thin air carried sound for miles. Fires lit around the perimeter cast long shadows, transforming the gathered warriors into giants in the eyes of the captives. The cold preserved the bodies of the dead for days, ensuring that any who stumbled upon the site long after would still see the exact posture of the fallen. In some cases, the Mongols spared a handful of prisoners at the end, releasing them not out of mercy, but as part of the design. These survivors were expected, and often commanded, to return to their people with a full account of what they had seen. It was, in essence, the same principle as the arrow that deliberately missed its mark. The wound it left was meant for the mind, not the body. Contemporary observers, such as the Persian historian Juvayni, recorded such events not as random cruelty, but as calculated governance through violence. The Mongols maintained a strict internal law code, the Yasa, among themselves, yet extended no such legal protection to their enemies. In their view, those who resisted forfeited not just their lives, but their dignity and death. To the Mongols, this was not savagery without reason. It was a political strategy, a tool of empire. Entire cities, hearing of the fate of others, surrendered without resistance, opening their gates rather than face annihilation. It was cheaper, faster, and more reliable than any prolonged siege. But the cost, for those chosen as examples, was a death that existed less for justice than for theater. Even centuries later, in the histories of the regions they conquered, the memory of these public executions lingered. In Russia, in Persia, in the lands of the Khwarezmian Empire, the Mongols were remembered not just for their victories in battle, but for the moments when no battle was necessary, when fear alone did the work of 1,000 arrows. The circle of death was not recorded in every campaign, but where it occurred, it became the kind of story that crossed generations. Grandparents told their grandchildren of the day the riders came, of the day the captive stood in a ring, of the sound the arrows made when they struck, and of the silence that followed. For the Mongols, the silence was the point. A silence that spread across valleys and deserts, that filled courts and marketplaces, a silence that made resistance feel like suicide. It was a silence that built an empire as surely as any victory on the field. In the cold logic of empire, the Mongols understood a truth that history has rarely forgotten. To kill a man is to end his life, but to kill him before an audience is to bind the living in chains stronger than any iron. In the winter of 1574, on the frozen outskirts of Pskov, the condemned were not led to the gallows. Instead, they were herded toward a timber palisade built hastily on the edge of a frozen meadow. The ground was packed hard with snow, trampled by the boots of soldiers and the restless pacing of something alive within. Word had spread days before that the voivode, under orders from the Tsar's envoys, had decreed an execution that would not soon be forgotten. For generations, the people of this borderland had lived with wolves, not as companions or symbols, but as a persistent terror. Packs would descend upon villages in lean winters, pulling livestock from pens, sometimes children from yards. The animals were feared as agents of divine punishment, and in the darker corners of orthodox belief, they were whispered to be carriers of unholy spirits. To be cast among them was more than a death sentence. It was an unclean end, one that denied the victim both burial rites and the dignity of the grave. The prisoners, accused of rebellion and consorting with Lithuanian enemies, were stripped of their belts and cloaks, bound in rough cord, and driven into the enclosure. At its far end, behind a crude gate of sharpened logs, the wolves stirred. They had been taken alive from the surrounding forests over the past month, trapped in iron snares and kept without food. By the first night, hunger had sharpened their movements to something almost unnatural. The crowd that gathered did so in silence. Punishment in Muscovy was rarely a private affair. Executions were meant to be witnessed. The voivode himself stood apart on a raised platform, flanked by guards with spears. His orders had been explicit. This would not be over quickly. It was to be a demonstration of the price of betrayal. The gate was raised by chains. For a moment, nothing happened. The wolves emerged cautiously, their breath steaming in the cold, their paws leaving black marks against the snow. They circled, scenting the captives. It was said that the first to break was not a prisoner but a wolf, a scarred male that lunged forward, snapping at a bound man's leg before retreating to test again. The animals knew the difference between live prey and the dead carrion they had been thrown in their cages. The condemned stood as close together as their bonds allowed, backs pressed tight. Some whispered prayers that froze in the air between their lips. Others were silent, resigned. When the first true attack came, it was sudden. A young prisoner was dragged down by the throat, the snow darkening beneath him. The sound of bones breaking carried in the stillness, and then the pack moved, each animal taking its turn in the tearing. This was the first night's feeding. The voivode allowed no intervention. Guards who stood ready with pikes to keep the wolves from climbing the palisade were forbidden from striking them away from the prisoners. The spectacle was deliberate. The survivors would live through the night knowing the wolves would return. By dawn, only 4 of the 7 condemned remained standing. They were herded to one side of the enclosure, their faces gray with frost and terror. The wolves, sated for the moment, were driven back into their pen, their muzzles red and steaming. In Muscovite law, certain crimes were punishable not merely by death, but by degradation. To be executed by wolves was to be treated as no better than carrion, an example meant to erode the morale of any who might dream of rebellion. Chroniclers who recorded the scoff executions noted the silence of the crowd afterward. There were no jeers, no satisfaction, only a collective awareness that this same fate could be arranged for anyone should they fall from favor. The first night's feeding was not the end. Those left alive would face the animals again on the second night, and again on the third, until none remained. In the voivode's ledger it was entered simply, "Justice done, wolves fed." What remained unrecorded was the quiet terror that followed. For weeks after, villagers refused to travel the road near the meadow after sunset. The wolves were said to linger there, drawn by the scent of men who had died not as warriors, but as meat. And in that winter the lesson endured. In a land where the Tsar's will was law, even nature itself could be turned into an instrument of human cruelty. In the 9th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire stood as one of the most feared powers in the ancient world. Its armies were relentless, its administration efficient, and its rulers unwavering in their pursuit of dominance. But it was not battlefield victories alone that secured Assyrian control. It was spectacle, calculated, public, and merciless. Ashurnasirpal II, who reigned from 883 to 859 BCE, understood this principle with chilling clarity. His reign was marked not only by relentless military campaigns, but by the deliberate use of terror as statecraft. Conquest was never complete with the capture of cities. It had to be sealed with a message that would echo for generations. That message was often carved into stone reliefs, written in cuneiform, and etched into the memories of those who survived his displays. The palace at Kalhu, his new capital, was more than a seat of power. It was a theater. Its vast halls were adorned with carved depictions of the king's victories. Enemies flayed alive, cities burning, prisoners led in chains. But the most horrifying message was reserved for the living. On the day of a great feast, Ashurnasirpal invited nobles from across the empire and emissaries from foreign states. They were honored guests, seated in long rows, served with platters of roasted meats, honeyed wine, and delicacies brought from conquered lands. Yet the true centerpiece of the occasion was not within the banquet hall. Outside the palace walls, in full view from the dining terraces, stood rows of tall wooden stakes. Upon them, the bodies of captured rebels and enemy leaders were impaled, their forms distorted, their mouths frozen open in agony. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of roasted lamb and rotting flesh. This was no accident. It was design. Ashurnasirpal sat at the head of the table beneath a canopy embroidered with gold. He said little. The court scribes recorded no speeches, no proclamations. The silence itself was a statement. Power did not plead, and it did not justify. The king's gaze often drifted past the food, past the courtiers, to the forest of impaled bodies swaying in the desert wind. His guests, too, could not look away for long. Every glance toward the horizon reminded them of the fate awaiting those who defied the Assyrian crown. The ritual of impalement was more than a killing method. It was a prolonged form of punishment. Victims could take hours, sometimes days, to die, depending on the position of the stake and the care taken to avoid immediate fatal wounds. For the Assyrians, it served as both retribution and deterrent. Ashurnasirpal was explicit in his inscriptions. He would spread terror among the lands. The banquet itself became an extension of this philosophy. Food and drink were abundant, yet each bite was taken under the shadow of death. Foreign envoys were meant to carry this memory back to their kings, recounting not only the military strength of Assyria, but the cruelty of its ruler. No amount of gold or soldiers could erase the image of a king who could eat in comfort while his enemies died in slow agony within sight of his table. Accounts from Ashurnasirpal's own royal annals do not shy from the brutality. He boasted of flaying leaders, hanging their skins on city walls, and lining roads with the bodies of the executed. In this context, the silent feast was not an isolated act of cruelty, but part of a broader system of rule by fear. The Assyrian Empire thrived on obedience, and obedience was most efficiently won through terror. As the feast continued, musicians played low, steady rhythms. Servants poured wine into the king's carved horn, refilling it without a word. Guests shifted uncomfortably, torn between the demands of protocol and the visceral horror of the spectacle. The silence was broken only by the occasional call of a desert bird or the faint groans from beyond the walls. When the feast ended, the guests were escorted out through the palace gates and past the stakes. This was the final deliberate step. Each dignitary left Kalhu carrying the scent of death, the memory of the king's unblinking stare, and the knowledge that the same fate could befall any who failed to bow deeply enough. In the decades following Ashurnasirpal's reign, Assyrian kings continued the tradition. The methods varied: mass deportations, public mutilations, ritual executions, but the principle remained unchanged. Rule was not sustained by law alone, but by the visible, unforgettable demonstration of what defiance would cost. The silent feast at Kalhu was never about food. It was about hunger. The king's hunger for submission, for fear, for absolute power. And in the Assyrian world, silence was never empty. It was full, heavy, and inescapable. The kind of silence that followed you home, into your dreams, and into the history that would remember you not for how you lived, but for how you died. Centuries later, when the walls of Kalhu lay in ruin, archaeologists uncovered the reliefs of impaled captives, mute stone echoes of the same message Ashurnasirpal had given in life. The ruler's table was always set with fear. They called it damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to the beasts. In the great amphitheaters of the Roman world, it was both a spectacle and a sentence, an instrument of power as much as punishment. To the Romans, it was not merely execution, it was theater, morality, and control, enacted in blood before tens of thousands. The condemned were not criminals in the modern sense alone. They were prisoners of war, political dissenters, slaves who had risen against their masters, and, in later centuries, members of outlawed religious sects. The method was chosen with precision, for it sent a message that lingered long after the screams had faded. The practice drew on older traditions. In Carthage and the eastern provinces, animals had been used in religious sacrifices for centuries. Rome repurposed this for civic discipline. Lions from Numidia, leopards from Anatolia, bears from the forests of Dacia, all were captured and transported over vast distances to feed this machinery of death. In the days before a major spectacle, the animals were kept hungry, denied food to sharpen their aggression. The victims, meanwhile, were imprisoned in darkness, hearing only the sounds of the crowd and the muffled roars beyond the gates. It was rarely over in an instant. Ancient writers record cases where the condemned were released in small groups, forced to wait as the beasts circled. Some animals, unfamiliar with human prey, hesitated. Handlers used heated irons to drive them forward. The crowd, restless for blood, jeered when the killings were slow. In certain executions, the victims were bound to stakes or dressed in the skins of wild animals so that the predators would see them as rivals or prey. Those too badly wounded to stand were left on the ground, their deaths prolonged for the crowd's satisfaction. The historian Cassius Dio described a grim spectacle under Emperor Severus. After a series of games, only a handful of captives remained from a larger group of rebels. These survivors were brought forward not to fight for their lives, but to be displayed as defeated enemies of the state. The animals were released one after another, each killing staged for maximum effect. They died as examples, Dio wrote, so that others might fear rebellion more than death itself. It was not only Rome's capital that saw such endings. In provincial arenas from North Africa to Gaul, local governors staged damnations to reinforce imperial authority. In 203 AD, in Carthage, Christians who refused to sacrifice to the emperor were condemned to the beasts in a public festival. According to contemporary accounts, after 2 days of executions, a small group of survivors, women and men alike, were brought back into the arena. They had been mauled but not killed in earlier bouts. Now they were thrown once more to the animals until none remained. The survivors' end was deliberate. It denied them the dignity of escape or exile, ensuring that no one could later claim that they had defied the state and lived. The ritual was as much psychological as physical, a final crushing demonstration that imperial justice reached its conclusion without hesitation or mercy. The crowd's role was central. In the Roman mind, these executions were acts of communal witnessing. Attendance was not only entertainment but participation in the reaffirmation of social order. To see a rebel, a deserter, or a religious outlaw destroyed by wild beasts was to see the hierarchy of Rome physically enforced. The survivors, those who had endured the first day's slaughter, were the last and most potent symbols. Their deaths were staged to seal the narrative. Defiance ends here. By the late Empire, the practice began to wane, condemned by some Christian emperors and hampered by the expense of acquiring and maintaining exotic animals. But for centuries, damnatio ad bestias had served as one of Rome's most public, most brutal instruments of control. It was not the quick death of a soldier in battle, nor the private execution of a criminal behind closed doors. It was slow, humiliating, and final, designed to leave nothing behind but fear. And when the gates closed on the last of the condemned, the sand was raked, the blood covered, and the crowd dispersed. The survivors were no longer survivors. They were a warning, erased in body but immortalized in memory, proof that in Rome's arenas, mercy had no place and survival was never the end. When the last wolf had retreated into the dark timberline and the final screams had dissolved into the cold, the chief gave no orders for collection or burial. The ritual's purpose was not merely the destruction of his enemies, it was the preservation of their defeat. Every body, every frozen face contorted in terror, every shattered limb and torn garment was part of the message he wished to send. The gorge became a gallery of death. The winter air preserved the remains longer than any summer sun could have allowed. Carrion birds circled above, their shadows crossing the snow like slow-moving omens. By the second day, packs of scavengers, foxes, feral dogs, and even the wolves who had once served the ritual returned to pick apart what was left. To the chief, this was not desecration, it was completion. The enemies who had once stood armed against him were reduced to nothing but offerings to the land, to the predators, and to the cold. Word of the ritual spread with astonishing speed. Traders who passed through the outer ridges carried it eastward, where settlers repeated it in hushed tones. Rival clans heard exaggerated versions within days, tales of the chief personally releasing the wolves, of him drinking from the skulls of his victims, of fires so bright the snow melted in great rings around the killing ground. Accuracy no longer mattered. The story had already grown larger than the event itself, its core truth enough to terrify any who might challenge his authority. For generations, the Appalachian Mountains had been a web of shifting alliances, betrayals, and violent contests for control. Yet few leaders had ever dared to employ such calculated brutality in public ritual. By leaving the bodies untouched, the chief ensured that his message would not be confined to rumor. Anyone who ventured through that gorge would see the evidence for themselves. The human remains still clad in the colors of their clans, the frozen expressions of those who had begged for mercy and found none. The psychological effect was profound. Even the strongest rival leaders began reconsidering their willingness to fight. If captured, they would not be ransomed, traded, or executed swiftly. They would be displayed, not in the symbolic dignity of a warrior's end, but as stripped carcasses in the open snow. For warriors who valued their reputation in death as much as in life, this was an erasure worse than execution. Settlers along the frontiers adapted the story to their own warnings, telling children to obey lest the chief's wolves come in the night. Among the native clans, however, the legend served a different function. A reminder that even in a land of constant struggle, there existed leaders who would go beyond the limits of traditional warfare to secure their power. The chief himself never publicly spoke of the ritual after the day it occurred. His silence allowed the tale to grow unchecked. To contradict or confirm would have been to interfere with the legend's evolution, and he understood the value of a myth that inspires fear. He needed no monuments, no written proclamations. His monument was the memory, burned into the minds of those who had walked through that gorge and seen the remains with their own eyes. Seasons changed, and eventually the snow melted. The bodies did not last forever. Bones were scattered by scavengers, drawn into the undergrowth, washed into the streams that fed the valleys. By summer, much of the scene was gone, yet the place remained avoided. Hunters would skirt the gorge entirely, unwilling to disturb the ground where the dead had lain. The absence of human voices there became its own form of preservation. In the years that followed, his rivals approached negotiations differently. Many would send envoys before war could begin, hoping to avoid capture entirely. Some clans agreed to pay tribute without resistance, calculating that surrender was preferable to the humiliation and terror of the chief's wolves. The ritual had shifted the balance of power without the need for repeated violence. Its single performance was enough to govern years of peace. Peace born not of reconciliation, but of dread. But fear has a half-life. The chief's reign, though prolonged by his calculated cruelty, would one day end, yet the story outlived him, whispered in camps and trading posts long after his bones were gone. Its persistence spoke not only to the act itself, but to the human need to remember such moments, to pass them down as warnings, even when the exact details become blurred. The gorge remained, its soil and stones bearing no visible scars to the untrained eye, but to those who knew, it was a place where the boundaries of human cruelty had been pushed beyond reason. And in that silent expanse, beneath the circling shadows of carrion birds, the chief had carved his true message into the collective memory of a people, that in the struggle for power, mercy was not weakness, it was absence. And in the mountains, absence was something no one could afford. In the winter of 1477, news of Vlad III's death spread across Wallachia and the surrounding principalities. It should have been the end of one of the most brutal reigns in Eastern European history, a ruler whose methods of control were as calculated as they were terrifying. Yet for the people who had lived under his iron hand, his absence was not freedom. The atmosphere he had created, a climate of constant dread, did not vanish with his corpse. It lingered, deeply rooted, like frost in the soil. During his reign, Vlad's punishments were never hidden. They were staged with precision in marketplaces, at crossroads, and along trade routes. Thousands of bodies were left to decay in the open, speared on sharpened stakes, a forest of the dead, sending an unmistakable message to friend and foe alike. Merchants from Saxony and Ottoman envoys alike carried tales of the sepoua, the impaling fields, back to their homelands. To see such horrors was to understand that defiance was not merely dangerous, it was unthinkable. It was this unshakable association between disobedience and extreme suffering that endured after his death. Children born in the last years of his rule grew up in a society where his punishments were not distant rumors but witnessed realities. A mother's warning, "Do not stray, or Vlad will take you," was not a folktale but a truth engraved into the memory of the community. The political vacuum after Vlad's assassination did little to soothe the people's fears. His rivals and successors inherited a throne still drenched in his methods. Even those who despised him found utility in his memory, invoking his name to enforce discipline and quell dissent. When taxes were levied or labor demanded, resistance was often silenced by the quiet reminder of what the last defiant ones had endured. Beyond Wallachia, his cruelty had become a diplomatic legend. In the Ottoman Empire, soldiers who had marched through forests of the impaled returned home unable to erase the image. In Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire, pamphlets chronicled his atrocities, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes understated, but always concluding with the same message: Vlad was a man who ruled through terror, and terror had worked. For decades, the psychological scar persisted. Villagers hesitated to speak ill of his name even in private. Travelers avoided certain roads long after the bodies had rotted away, believing the soil itself was cursed. Monks in remote monasteries copied accounts of his punishments not as moral lessons, but as warnings of the dangers of power unchecked. In time, the physical evidence of his reign, the stakes, the battlefields, the burnt villages, faded into the earth. But the cultural inheritance of fear proved far more enduring. Vlad became both a deterrent and a myth, a presence invoked not just by rulers, but by ordinary people seeking to keep order in their homes. This is the true legacy of rulers who govern through calculated brutality. Their control extends beyond their lifetime, woven into the psychology of the population. Fear, once instilled with such precision, does not die with the tyrant. It is passed down, reshaped into warnings, legends, and whispered memories. Centuries later, when his life became the basis for foreign tales and Gothic novels, the people of his homeland remembered him differently. To outsiders, he was a monstrous curiosity. To them, he was a man whose reign had proven that terror could be as enduring as bloodlines. The lesson was not about cruelty for cruelty's sake, but about the efficiency of fear when wielded with methodical intent. Vlad III had ruled a fragmented, threatened land. He had faced enemies at his borders and traitors within. He had chosen terror as his weapon, and it had worked so well that its echoes outlived him by generations. In the deep winters of the Carpathians, long after his body was lost to history, the silence of certain forests seemed heavier. Villagers would not camp there. Shepherds drove their flocks along longer paths to avoid them. The wolves still roamed, but it was the memory of the man, not the beasts, that made the air feel colder. Vlad III's death had not freed Wallachia from his grip. The land he ruled had been reshaped by his hand, and his absence was only a physical one. In the minds of his people and in the policies of those who followed, the shadow of the impaler remained. And so, long after his heart ceased to beat, Vlad's true reign continued. Not in the palaces of power, but in the quiet submission of those who still feared his return. History's darkest chapters are not just tales of cruelty, they are mirrors, reflecting the capacity for human brutality when power is wielded without conscience. From ancient courts to medieval battlefields, the tools of fear have shaped nations, silenced generations, and carved legacies in blood and memory. These are not relics to be forgotten, but warnings to be remembered. Every impalement, every ritual, every silent surrender speaks across centuries. It can happen again. Study these truths, speak of them, question those who rule. For only in confronting history's horrors can we hope to break the cycle.